Hey guys, it's me, Bernie Bear, and welcome back to another video. In this video, I want to tackle Mrs. Afton. In this video, I want to tackle the mystery of Mrs. Afton, who she is, what her role in the story is, and ultimately what happens to her. And don't worry, I won't say that she's running Fazbear Entertainment. There's actually a decent amount of references to Mrs. Afton throughout the franchise that will hopefully give us some hints and clues as to her story. So without further ado, let's begin. I want to start off with the thing that might give us the most backstory on Mrs. Afton, the Security Breach retro CDs. I know some people don't like looking at these for evidence because they think, oh, well how would Vanessa and or Glitchtrap know about the Aftons' past? And besides, in one of the CDs, one of the therapists says that the backstory is fake, so therefore it can't be real. But like, did they even listen to the CDs? Vanessa is the one who gives the fake custody backstory, but it's patient 46/Gregory who's actually called out for lying about their childhood.
Wanna guess what I found out when I looked into the tragedy of your past? All that stuff about your parents? You aren't even gonna look at me? Fine. You can look at the floor all you want. But it won't change the fact that none of what you said in your file about your parents was true. The truth is, you had great parents. A great childhood. Why did you lie?
Patient 46 lied and said something tragic happened to their parents, but in the last retro CD, they get called out for their lie, as it turns out that they had great parents and a great childhood. Compare that to what Vanessa says, where her father named Bill made her follow instructions and give a fake testimony in a court battle between her mom and her dad, and they don't really sound all too similar. I feel like if Vanessa and Gregory gave the same backstory, Steelbull would have made it way more obvious that they are the same backstories, or they would have had one of the therapists call out Vanessa for the lie in addition to Gregory, but they didn't, so I'm willing to bet that they used different backstories. Now, Vanessa was most definitely told to give her fake backstory from Glitchtrap / the Mimic, and since the Mimic is currently mimicking William Afton, wouldn't it make sense for him to tell Vanessa, who already shares some similarities to Elizabeth Afton as heard in the retro CDs, to give Elizabeth's backstory? And it would make sense for the Mimic to give her a nearly accurate description of what happened too, since, you know, he's mimicking William, and since he's already infiltrated a big fraction of Fazbear Entertainment at this point, it would make sense that he would have access to that information too. So, with all that finally out of the way, let's take a look at what we're told in the CDs. Apparently, Bill, William, used his daughter, Elizabeth, in court to make his wife, Mrs. Afton, look bad so that he would get full custody of his kids. Elizabeth was told to give a fake testimony, and it worked. William won custody of his kids, and in response to losing her kids, Mrs. Afton killed herself, judging by the static cut in the CD.
I know your mum after she lost the custody case.
We know it was Elizabeth who was used by William since A, it's Vanessa giving the backstory, and as pointed out before, she already shares a lot in common with Elizabeth, whether that's the Mimic's influence or not. B, Vanessa says that she was meant to be a good girl.
I was supposed to be a good girl.
It wouldn't really make sense for Michael or the Crying Child to say that, so it leaves us with Elizabeth. And C, in the books, Elizabeth will do anything to get her father's approval, so she could have easily been manipulated into lying for him if it meant the slightest bit of attention from her father. Honestly, there's only one real problem I have with this whole custody battle situation. William does not care for his children, so why would he go out of his way to make sure he keeps custody of them? Now, I can think of two possible explanations for this. Either he just wanted to keep them so he could experiment on them if need be, like he most likely did with the Crying Child in the FNaF 4 experiments, or as a way of showing dominance over his wife. He didn't really want his kids, he just wanted to make his wife hurt, and he did just that. To be honest, I think both of these answers can be correct, since they kind of complement each other in a way. So I guess that solves my problem with this. Epic. Hey guys, Editing Gavin here, and I just wanted to quickly pop in to say that in the time between me writing this video's script and me actually editing the video, I've become more hesitant to use the retro CDs as a part of Mrs. Afton's backstory. At the moment, I'm kind of torn between Vanessa actually being an Afton in the games or not, since there's compelling evidence from the movie and FNaF AR emails. If she is an Afton, then the retro CDs would genuinely be about her, which would explain why she's not called out for a lie, but if she isn't an Afton in the games, then they have to be about Elizabeth and her mother, not Vanessa and hers. But until we get solid evidence that either confirms or debunks the theory of her being an Afton in the games, I'm just gonna say this. Whenever I bring up the retro CDs and my final conclusion about Mrs. Afton at the end of the video, please take it with a grain of salt. Now, back to the video. More evidence for the whole divorce that leads into a custody battle thing comes from Fazbear Frights, and more specifically the story Step Closer, which already has huge parallels to the Afton family with Pete and Chuck. In the story, Pete and Chuck's parents are getting divorced. That's it. Okay, maybe it's not the best supporting evidence, but it's supporting evidence. This could give us a rough time frame of when the divorce happens, though, since the parallel for the crying child is still alive, but we really can't say for sure. Moving on, let's take a look at Ballora, who really was the starting point for the Mrs. Afton theories. Now, I'm one of those people who does think Ballora was based off Mrs. Afton. First, you've got Ballora's more adult design, which doesn't really fit in with the other fun times, so she already stands out. Then there's Ballora's voice line from Ultimate Custom Night, where she states that William wanted to let her in.
Admit it. You wanted to let me in. These are strange circumstances that have brought us together.
Since Ultimate Custom Night takes place in a purgatory-like state inside William's mind, lines like these can make sense if they're coming from William's deep subconscious. If William did shut out Mrs. Afton to focus on his work, then yeah, that line makes sense. And then of course, there's Security Breach, where the Mrs. Afton staff bot looks very similar to Ballora, implying that she could be based off of her. Also, if you believe the theory that the Funtime animatronics represent the Afton family, Baby being Elizabeth, Funtime Foxy being Michael, Funtime Freddy being the crying child, and Ballora being Mrs. Afton, then I guess that's some additional evidence. I don't know if that was intended or not, though, since Funtime Chica exists, but at least just looking at the sister location cast alone, this theory makes sense, I guess. Also, I know one of the biggest pieces of evidence for Mrs. Afton being the reference point for Ballora is her song, Crumbling Dreams, but I personally don't think it's good evidence. The song features the lyrics, "Why do you hide inside your walls when there's music in my halls? All I see is an empty room, no more joy, an empty tomb," which people say could parallel Mrs. Afton's thoughts and sadness. They also say that the line "empty tomb" might hint that someone close to Mrs. Afton died, hence why she, or I guess Ballora, is so sad. But I think she's just talking about her room, the Ballora Gallery. It's an empty room, pitch black with nothing but the sound of her music to keep her company, so of course you'd think it was a tomb. And besides, would William really program in his wife's true feelings about life into an animatronic meant to entertain kids? Happy birthday, Billy! Everyone you know and love is going to die one day. So, what does Ballora end up telling us then? Well, honestly, I don't think it's much. Sure, it's cool that Ballora might have been inspired by Mrs. Afton, but that really doesn't tell us anything about her. Ballora's UCN voice line at least gives us a little bit more to work with, telling us that William didn't let Mrs. Afton into his life, but other than that, nothing really of substance. The next potential reference point also comes from sister location, and it's the Immortal and the Restless. Editing Gavin here once again. I pretty much redid this entire segment of the video, since I wasn't really happy about what I said about it, so I just decided to redo it, which means re-recording it, which is why I sound different. Anyway, the most popular theory about this show is that it's about William, Vlad, Mrs. Afton, Clara, and Michael, the baby. After all, Vlad wears purple, has a son that looks and acts just like him, and ends up getting his house burned down. So boom, case closed on the only solid answer, right? Wrong. There's another interpretation that we have to address too, since it was specifically called out to us in the survival logbook. In the book, there's one line Michael writes about relating to Clara that really sticks out to me. He says that he relates to her because everything about this place is crazy, and no one seems to notice except him. Under this interpretation, Vlad would represent Fazbear Entertainment, since Mike is actively fighting against them. If Michael represents Clara, then that would explain why she ends up burning down Vlad's house, since we're pretty sure Michael does that in FNaF 3. And then the baby would be... I don't know what the baby would represent. Look, I think this explanation works. I think both of the explanations work. Both of them have sufficient enough evidence that we can't rule out either of them. They also both have their flaws. If Vlad is William, why do he and Clara make up at the end of the season, when we know they eventually get divorced? Although, the fact that there's a next season could explain that. Maybe the first season ends on a happy note, but the show overall ends on a sad note. Kind of like how the Afton's marriage ends on a sad note once Mrs. Afton presumably takes her own life. On the other hand, Clara making up with Vlad doesn't make sense if Mike is meant to represent Clara, since we never see Mike make up with Fazbear Entertainment. Maybe you could say them making up, and heck, even the baby, represent Michael's Pizzeria in FNaF 6, which he runs, but I don't know. I think that's really a stretch. Besides, the pair only ever make up in the fake ending episode, so either this episode shouldn't be considered canon, since it's in the fake ending, or it's a ruin situation, where even though the ending might not be canon, the area, or in this case episode, still exists. It's just not viewed in the canon ending of the game. I'm willing to bet it's the latter option, which means that William and his wife were most likely able to make their relationship last long enough to have the crying child in Elizabeth. I think it would be okay if we used both of these explanations in our overall conclusion. We get a more literal explanation of Michael's relationship with his father, and we also get to learn about Michael's character from his comment on Clara. If she represents Mrs. Afton, and Mike relates to her, that means that although he might look just like his father, Mike relates more to his mother, and gets some of his best traits from her. One small, maybe Mrs. Afton related thing I want to bring up comes in the fourth closet. In it, there's a scene... It's British as fuck. In it, the... God damn. In it, the... God In it, there's a scene where Elizabeth is going to show her dad, William, a paper from school. Right before she tries to show William the paper, though, someone, quote, gently touched her back, encouraging her to run forward into the room, into the dark. And that's it. That's literally all we get on this mystery character. They're never explained, never elaborated upon, nothing. And it can't be Charlie or Baby, since as far as we know, they can't influence the past memories Elizabeth shows Charlie. So either it's some kind of caretaker or babysitter, or it's Mrs. Afton. It probably isn't Michael either, since as far as we know, Michael Afton doesn't exist in this universe. Honestly, it doesn't really matter if it's Mrs. Afton or not, since it doesn't tell us anything about her either way. I just wanted to quickly bring this up, since I've literally never seen anybody talk about it, probably because it's like a non-existent character in the final book in the trilogy. This video just felt like the most appropriate place to do it, though. I also quickly want to bring up Midnight Motorist. If you think that the runaway is Michael, then the couch person would either have to be Henry or Mrs. Afton, and if it's Mrs. Afton, then it shows that she cares about Mike, and is willing to stand up for him to some degree. And if you think the crying child is the runaway, then I guess the only place Mrs. Afton could possibly be is the mound, since at this point in the timeline it can't be anyone else. But since Midnight Motorist is still such a heavily debated topic, I don't want to use it for evidence for or against anything. So, now that we've addressed all of our references to Mrs. Afton, I think we have enough info to be able to piece together a story for her. Let's put it all together, and see if we can solve this woman's story. William and his wife have a son named Michael. He looks identical to his father, but despite this, William denies Michael being his son, which puts tension on his relationship with his wife. Despite this, they have 2 more kids, Elizabeth and the crying child. William spends his days completely focused on his work, paying no attention to his wife or kids. Mrs. Afton, realizing just how neglectful William is, and how harmful that could be for their kids, files a divorce, which ends up leading into a court battle for custody of the kids. William uses this as an opportunity to hurt his wife, so he manipulates Elizabeth into lying about her mom to sway the court in William's favor, and it's because of this that he ultimately ends up winning the custody case. Mrs. Afton, being unable to save her kids from the monster that is her former husband, finally reaches her breaking point. She ends up taking her own life, and maybe gets buried out in the woods near their home. Later in life, when Michael is an adult, even though he might look a lot like his father, he gets his compassion and ability to see the weirdness in things from his mother. So, in a way, it's Mrs. Afton's influence on her son that ultimately helps Mike survive Five Nights at Freddy's.
Someone cooked here.
And there we go. Is this the actual story of Mrs. Afton that Scott intended? Probably not. I'm not entirely sold on some of the pieces of evidence, but hey, with what we found, I'd say we did a good job at piecing together a story that does kind of make a little bit of sense, especially narratively. And when it comes to FNaF, I would say that's a job well done. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.